There is no way that we can reach our goals with only switching to renewable energy, as you are mentioning.
One thing is for sure. The future of our personal mobility will be electric. One large car manufacturer after the other in the recent month came up with quite ambitious decarbonization goals and electrification goals. Usually they want to fully electrify their fleets and model ranges until the early 2030s. However, this can only be a first step of, in my eyes, 3 steps. Additionally, car manufacturers have to also decarbonize the manufacturing process, and apart from that, as people, we have to de-own mobility, meaning we have to let go of personal ownership of cars and move to concepts such as car sharing. So where are we at in these 3 stages? Today we'll dive into exactly these topics with 2 experts. One representing the organization that actually started off the whole diesel scandal around companies such as Volkswagen, and the other representing Europe's very first fully electric performance car brand. Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. I'm very excited because today is actually one of the very few episodes where we'll have 2 guests at the same time. One of them being Sandra Wappelhorst, who's a senior researcher on electric vehicles at ICCT, the International Council on Clean Transportation. It's basically a non-profit organization that provides unbiased research and analysis to environmental regulators, and is also the organization that the team of the Smartery turns to if they really want to have matter-of-fact numbers on developments in clean transportation. And most prominently, they've also been the organization that kickstarted basically the whole diesel scandal by doing some very real-world tests of diesel cars. Welcome, Sandra.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Our second guest is Lisa Bolin, who's climate lead at Polestar, basically a company that stands for the whole transformation that the car industry is currently going through. Polestar is Volvo's former performance car brand that now, with the help of Chinese manufacturer Geely, turned into Europe's very first fully electric performance car brand. Great to have you with us, Lisa.
Thank you so much.
Well, let's start with you, Sandra. I think it's fair to say that with the emission test that the ICCT did a couple of years ago, you basically threw a snowball and you started an avalanche. Did you ever expect it to turn out this big as it did?
Well, it was not to be expected that this would lead to a global scandal as it turned out in the end. But it did impact the mobility world a lot. And we see that the car manufacturers are now more and more committing to electrify their vehicle fleets, that testing requirements have been changed and to be more sensitive about pollutant emissions from vehicles.
That's putting it in a very humble way, I would say. I think without the diesel scandal, for example, Volkswagen surely would not have done such a fast turnaround, not such a radical turnaround in going fully electric. Well, I think it's a sign that other car companies really take electrification really serious, also by the kind of positions they introduce into their companies. I think climate lead is a position that hasn't been around for quite a while.
Yeah, so as climate lead, my responsibility is to develop and also, but maybe more, also implement climate strategies in our company that are relevant and also take into account, of course, the climate crisis that we are in and the situation we are in. So for us, it's really important to have those roles that really can focus on the topics that are really the things that need to be addressed.
Which I think is quite an interesting point, because I think companies that do take climate neutrality really serious need to start also reflecting that in their organization, in positions such as yours, or introducing right management KPIs that are really measurable and setting goals that are very concrete and measurable. What are the goals for Polestar at the moment?
As a company, we are aiming to become climate neutral in 2040, but we have committed to make net zero vehicle by 2030. So that's a project that we call Polestar Zero Projects.
I think the distinction between those two different goals, one on the product level and one on the company level, is quite important. So maybe you could dive a little bit deeper and explain the difference between both goals.
Yeah, so if we look at the goal towards 2040, it's very clear to us that the scientific society and IPCC, which is, the organization, we can say, that kind of collects all the knowledge that is there on the climate issue. For us, it's very clear that, you cannot set climate neutrality goal later than 2050. We have to become climate neutral as a world by then. So we have set this goal for 2040. It's also in line with what Volvo Cars has, which is a partner for us. So that's kind of for our whole company to work towards that, including business travels, including things that are not direct materials going into the car. But also the cars, of course, which is our biggest, the materials of the car is the big source of CO2 and other climate emissions for us. But for the 2030 project, Polestar Zero project, it's a little bit different in the way that we see that we need something to spark this. Many times you look at what can we do now, you kind of look for the low-hanging fruits. But if we're going to reach climate neutrality in the long run, we cannot wait with the hard stuff.
And with hard stuff, I guess you mean not only building an electric car, but really looking at the carbon footprint throughout its whole life cycle. So what numbers are you looking at? What's the footprint you need to bring down until 2030?
Yeah, so we did a life cycle assessment of Polestar 2, which is we can say that's our first full electric vehicle, and after that we are planning on only making EVs. Then that had a carbon footprint of 26 tons of CO2 per car when it comes out of our factory. So that's what we call cradle to gate. But then we also included the use phase and end of life, and the use phase is very dependent on what type of electricity you charge. So we made different scenarios for that. The important thing is that the potential, of course, if you use renewable energy to charge, then you will end up with just a little bit more than those 26 tons. But for our challenge as an EV company, we cannot rely on, get rid of tailpipe emissions. We don't have those. So for us, we now have to put all efforts into getting those 26 tons down to zero. And that's kind of the goal for that Polestar Zero project, to really tackle all the hard things that we cannot yet see the solutions for, and show that it is possible to make a vehicle that also has pushed down those cradle to gate emissions, because that's the way we have to go, even for the EV. It's not sold just because you drive an electric car, unfortunately.
So when building an electric car, the main focus is on the cradle-to-gate emissions, whereas when building a combustion engine car, the main focus is on the tailpipe emissions, so the CO2 emissions, while driving, basically. Something that the EU, for example, wants to come up with much stricter rules next year already. And I think the ICCT, Sandra, just recently published a paper assessing the CO2 reduction potential and estimated costs for current policies in 3 different policy scenarios. So what are the key findings and how does it relate to the Green Deal? Because obviously it's something that's quite significant, because at least for the next 10 years, we will still have to deal with new combustion engine cars and vans on our street here in the EU.
So our modeling shows that in order to be in line with the European Green Deal, you mentioned the average CO2 emissions of new passenger cars need to reduce by at least 70% by 2030 compared to 2021 baseline. And at the latest by 2035, all new passenger cars need to be fully electric. And from a vehicle technology perspective, meeting the targets of the European Green Deal is feasible. Not saying that it will be easy, but there are no fundamental challenges. The key technologies like battery electric and eventually fuel cell electric vehicles are available. And the additional manufacturing costs for these technologies are expected to come down significantly in the next years. And the cost savings for consumers and society are expected to be high. And you mentioned our study, and we have looked at different policy scenarios. And in the most ambitious scenario, we assume that all new cars will be electric already by 2030. And we find that this is the scenario with the highest savings for consumers and society, higher than for the other scenarios in which combustion engine vehicles will only be phased out by 2035 or later. So, in other words, protecting the climate and securing cost saving for consumers in this case go hand in hand. This is due to the fact that we expect the cost of battery electric vehicles to drastically decrease in the coming years. So while currently lithium-ion batteries for vehicles still cost around 140 euros per kilowatt hour, costs will decrease to a level of about 60 euros per kilowatt hour by 2035, we estimate. At the same time, battery electric vehicles are much more efficient than combustion engine vehicles, thereby helping consumers to reduce the running costs currently spent on the refuel of a battery electric vehicle than a combustion engine vehicle, we estimate as well. So strictly speaking, this is already the case today in some European countries for an average driver, such as in Germany, for example. However, only because there are quite generous government subsidies for BEVs at the moment. But what we find, though, is that by around 2025, battery electric vehicles will be cost efficient for consumers, even without any government subsidies.
Wow, there were quite a few takeaways in your statement already. On the one hand, I'm quite surprised to hear how soon fully electric vehicles would be cost effective already in only 4 years from now, basically. That's much sooner than I personally would have expected because after all, they compete with a technology that really has been honed and fine-tuned over more than 100 years already. So combustion engine cars. Also quite interesting that this would be already cost-effective without subsidies. And what probably is the most important statement you made is that the more ambitious we are, the fewer are the costs for your average consumer, which probably is one of the biggest arguments to make. So what are the most important levers to get there as soon as possible? Is it further subsidies for electric cars or for charging infrastructure? Is it taxes on CO2 for combustion engine cars? Is it bans in the inner city? There's so many different levers a government can pull. Which one would you recommend?
So in general, from our research, we see that we need a comprehensive mix of measures. And this starts when we look at Europe at the European level, goes down to the national level, state and local levels. So in the end, we need a mix of different policies. And when you are asking which subsidies or which incentives policies are most powerful, so we see the EU regulation, the CO2 standards for new passenger cars and vans that last year with tighter emission limits, that we had a high uptake of electric vehicles. When we come back to the national level, we see that financial and fiscal incentives are very powerful as well, like subsidies on car purchase, one-time grants for consumers when they are purchasing an electric car. And in Europe, most or a lot of member states actually do offer one-time purchase incentives for electric cars. Also powerful are taxes on registration. Some countries do levy taxes when registering a vehicle for the first time, and also on ownership. What is very special for Europe are company cars. So a lot of your vehicles registered in Europe are registered by companies. And so here we also have a lot of incentives for companies itself, but also for the private use of a company car. Again, this is very special for Europe or European countries. Also, about half of the European member states offer tax incentives for the private use of an electric company car, like tax exemptions or preferential rates compared to internal combustion engine vehicles. But there's certainly much more out there also at the local level, like parking or charging benefits. You talked about bans. I would rather talk about vehicle access regulation, which are very common at city levels, low emission zones or congestion charging schemes, where you can also provide incentives or benefits for electric vehicle drivers, like in the United Kingdom, in London, the congestion charging scheme that offers exemptions for electric vehicle drivers. And people who drive a combustion engine car need to pay a daily fee to enter the congestion charging zones. So, and we also see that more and more cities, also particularly in Europe, are planning not only low emission zones, but also zero emission zones like Amsterdam, Paris. In the future, they're aiming to only allow electric vehicles in the city. So there's a lot out there, and a combination of all, a comprehensive mix at different levels is necessary, and also that different stakeholders work together, from the energy provider, local authorities, national authorities.
Well, that's quite an impressive list of levers one can pull to make car mobility more climate compatible, I would say. I think what's most important for me is that if you want to be more ambitious than the overall EU goals that also have been introduced with the Fit for 55 strategy, is that individual cities can actually charge ahead and be much more ambitious than the goals we have on an EU level, which is something I'll come back to in just a minute. But before I do that, over to you, Lisa. You already mentioned one of the main focuses at Polestar is bringing down the cradle-to-gate emissions. So how much do you see a car manufacturer also in the responsibility to look at the whole life cycle at the scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions? For example, on actually, first of all, making it possible that you can charge your car wherever you are. So on also driving the availability of charging points, one, then looking at scope 3 emissions, so making it possible that car owners can actually charge their car not only with an energy mix of 50 renewable and 50 fossil, but ideally 100% renewable. And then on the long run, actually incentivizing not only car ownership, but also a car sharing approach.
Yeah, so I mean, if I go back to our LCA study of Polestar 2, it's very clear that there is a huge potential already today. If you charge your electric vehicle, your Polestar 2 in this case, with green electricity, it will just outperform an ICE, of course, in terms of CO2 emissions through its lifetime. So, I mean, it's really important for us to make it possible for our customers to do that choice. But we put requirements on all our suppliers or partners when it comes to climate. So that's how we work with it. I mean, right now, we also have, when it comes to shared mobility, we can say like this: the electric vehicle will be a part of a huge ecosystem that has to, our whole mobility system has to change, including business models, including electric grids that you were mentioning. And we are open for that. And we are open to adapt to new ways of doing business, I would say. We have one project going on together with the Research Institute in Sweden that is looking at adaptive design for electric vehicles to kind of see and how ideas for circular business models can be developed. So, we are looking into that question. We also have another research project together with, funded by Swedish Energy Agency, together with a huge amount of partners on vehicle to grid. We really see that, there has to be a lot of collaboration and dialogue between stakeholders here, because the electric vehicle can only be as good as the infrastructure and system it's in, So we have to see that all the assets and all the value we put into that car can be utilized. And that's a really good thing with the vehicle to grid, to be able to utilize a battery more efficiently.
So let's imagine for a moment that we successfully electrified car mobility. And as you mentioned, all stakeholders successfully also collaborated together. So you're able to charge them 100% with renewables, and you're able to integrate them into a smart grid where, for example, the car batteries also can act as a buffer for the grid as such and shave off peaks in the grid. Is that enough to reach our climate goals already in regards to car mobility?
There is no way that we can reach our goals with only switching to renewable energy, as you are mentioning. We have to be much more efficient, which also means, working with all the different parts of circularity, which is reuse, remanufacturing, recycling, all those things. And that's something that's going to be crucial, like you mentioned, for all products, I think, in the future, because even if we become climate neutral, there is also other environmental aspects that had to be addressed. And those are very much addressed through the circularity perspective, I would say.
Introducing circularity into your business model, into your products, fortunately, is something that I hear more and more companies talk about. But I think it is just one of these, in brackets, buzzwords that's just about to gain some traction. Hopefully, obviously, will be embraced much more and then executed in the near future. However, it is still a bit future talk. So if we look at the very real challenges we have already right now in regards to electric mobility, for example, I think one is certainly charging stations. And it's certainly one of the big things where consumers still are pondering getting an electric car just because they're afraid that there's not enough charging points for them. In numbers, it does look good already. I think there are 287,000 public charging points in Europe. That's more than there are gas stations. However, they do not seem to be distributed very well. However, it is expected that until 2030, so in 10 years, that number will be actually 10 times as much. So will that be sufficient, Sandra? And are we on a good way getting there?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So first of all, it's a big challenge to deploy charging infrastructure, and that needs to be taken on by the European Commission and the national governments quickly and powerfully. Is it sufficient, the entire number? But it's also important what kind of charging infrastructure we need. Do we need more normal charging points or fast charging points? And it also depends on the vehicle mix. That means the ratio of battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So battery electric vehicles can make use of fast charging, but this is generally not the case for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So the policy focus might rather be in countries like that, like in Sweden, where we have a high share of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Here on the deployment on home and workplace charging and normal charging points. So different aspects that play a role in how much and what kind of charging infrastructure is necessary.
I must say that does sound rather complex. So if I compare that to ICE cars, you just have a standard gas station, you have maybe 3 or 4 different types of gasoline. It's always the same nozzle that goes into the car. That seems to be fairly simple. What I think is also one big difference is the nature of how people are charging. If you have an ICE car, unless you are a farmer who has his own private gas station for his tractor, you always go out of home to a gas station. Actually, with electric cars, I think the pattern is completely the other way around. Almost 90% would charge at home. So what does that mean?
It is true that most of the charging is expected to be at home, either at their own garage or close by. So what it certainly needs support by the governments on the one hand. We still need public charging infrastructure to guarantee for longer trips, for example, that charging is possible.
From expected scenarios, maybe let's just have a look into already matter-of-fact scenarios and have a look into one of the regions of the world where you actually can already see a lot of electric cars on the street, which must mean there are enough charging points. Talking obviously about Scandinavia. So Lisa, you being from Scandinavia, living in Sweden, what's the scenario in Scandinavia?
So, I mean, in the Scandinavian countries, Norway is is definitely the leading one in the amounts of EVs that are driving on the streets, I think, even if you see a lot of electric vehicles now in Sweden too. But I would say that the trend here is that many people charge at home, but we shouldn't maybe think that that is always going to be the case. I mean, some people might not be buying an electric vehicle because they cannot charge at home and that there is a lack of infrastructure. So, I mean, there will be a need of robust infrastructure in also in here, of course, so that the car can be used by more people, not only the ones who have their own garage.
And that's something I can personally relate to, actually, because at the moment I live in Berlin, in the inner city, in the 5th floor of a apartment building, and I just would not want to throw out my charging cable from the 5th floor in order to charge my plug-in hybrid, for example. And public charging points are still very rare and very high in demand. So I can personally relate to that. So we heard it. Electric cars are the future, and combustion engine cars, at the moment at least, have the status of the typewriter of the past. But, and that is very important, in order to turn electric mobility really into zero-emission mobility, there is a lot of work to be done. First of all, very basically, we have to make sure you can actually charge your car, and we have to scale up the charging infrastructure. Then, most importantly, we have to make sure that you actually can charge it with renewables and not with a mix of 50% renewables and 50% fossil energy. And more important than that, we really have to put a lot of focus into the cradle-to-gate emissions, so really making the manufacturing bit of electric cars much more climate-friendly. And then, on the long run, as Lisa mentioned, focus on the circularity of all the resources and the energy going into the full life cycle of a car. That is a lot of work to be done. That is a major change for the car industry that needs to be done. But as Sandra said, that change is really worth it. And the faster we go about it, the more we take our foot from the brakes and put it on the accelerator, the lower the actual cost for us as a society are going to be. And I think that is the most important bit. The more courageous we are, the more committed we are, the less it's actually going to cost us, the more everybody is going to benefit. Thanks a lot for all of your insights. So thanks a lot, Sandra.
Thank you.
And thanks a lot, Lisa.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for more episodes of the Smarter E podcast. For more information on the entire spectrum of electromobility, visit Power to Drive Europe, the international exhibition for charging infrastructure and e-mobility. Under the motto, Charging the Future of Mobility, Power to Drive Europe is the ideal meeting point for manufacturers, suppliers, installers, fleet and energy managers, distributors, and startups. Learn more online at powertodrive.de.